Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Wojciech Michal. I'm a student from Poland. I came from Krakow. This is my first time in Russia. I've enjoyed it very much, and thank you for all of you being here for my paper. Also, I would like to express my gratitude to Konstantin for inviting me and also taking care of me. And as he mentioned, today I will speak about the problem of Gnosis in Vladimir Lossky and St. Gregory Palamas. Okay, so in the chapter 10, which deals with the issue of the way to union with God, our author illustrates basic aspects of the Orthodox view on deification, Greek theosis, beginning with the starting point of the spiritual life, the conversion, Greek epistrophe, and repentance, Greek metanoia. It is defined as an attitude of the will turning towards God and renouncing the world. What is very important for Lossky is that the process of conversion is understood as a process of reintegration, centralization of the soul, which should keep itself in the very palace of heart. Delving into what it means for the soul to return itself to itself, Lossky introduces the terms of the heart and the spirit. The heart, Greek kardia, according to the author, is the center of the human being, the root of the intellect and the will, and the source of all spiritual activity. Meanwhile, the spirit, Greek nous or pneuma, is to be understood as the highest part of the man, the contemplative faculty by which man is able to seek God, but also as the most personal part of man where his freedom and consciousness reside. So what is already very important to notice here is that in the above definitions, the intellect and the will proceeding from the heart are clearly distinguished from the consciousness and the freedom belonging to the spirit. Thus, whenever Lossky uses terms connected with the consciousness in the theological context, it is necessary to remember that this term is not to be understood as a specific type of intellectual perception or as a psychological concept, but rather as a form of experience proper to the human spirit. Being two different realities, the heart and the spirit must be united, as these two elements of human nature may only act properly through and with each other. This process of uniting the heart with the spirit is nothing but the true meaning and purpose of conversion. Now, what's very important, this first stage of human ascent towards God consists in two different elements: the praxis, ascesis, and the contemplation, Greek theoria. Although being different, they coexist as one source of the true Christian knowledge, which Lossky refers to as Gnosis. This term, usually translated simply as knowledge, is defined here by our author as the personal and conscious experience of spiritual realities. So this spiritual consciousness, Gnosis, is not only a phenomenon accompanying higher stages of spiritual ascent, but rather, for Lossky, it is a necessary component of the Christian life, a witness to the inner state of our nature. The spirit, being in its essence a contemplative faculty, may not be both healthy and deprived of its power to see God, just as an eye, which cannot see natural light, must certainly be sick. So when the eye is sick, then it doesn't see. Similarly, the spirit, when it's sick, it also cannot see God. Being an experience of the spiritual and the divine, Gnosis appears moreover as a dynamic reality, increasing with the ability of the spirit to accept more and more of God's grace. As Lossky puts it, Gnosis, or personal awareness, grows in the measure in which nature becomes transformed by entering into an ever closer union with deifying grace. In one who is perfect, there will remain no further room for the unconscious, for the instinctive or involuntary. All will be illumined with divine light, appropriated to the human person, which has acquired its proper character by the gift of the Holy Spirit. The life of grace must thus be an increasing progress in knowledge, a growing experience of the divine light. It is an experience given to all Christians whose spirits have been sacramentally joined to the baptismal grace. Once given, this grace, however, does not lose its character of a personal gift from God to man. And so it may be taken away or added in abundance, depending on the capacity of the receiver. Thus, when we sin, the light of grace decreases until vanishing totally. On the other hand, when we become purified from our passions, the light may burn in us with immense power, even visibly for others, as was in the case of a great Russian saint, Saint Seraphim of Sarov. The vision of the light, being nothing but Gnosis par excellence, is identical with the heavenly bliss, utmost peace, and silence in its meaning of hezekia. Meanwhile, the lack of this experience, agnoia, must be identical with the darkness of hell, with no space left for freedom or consciousness. The way to God is thus a movement from darkness to the light, from agnoia to gnosis. Summarizing his views on this topic in chapter 12, Lossky writes, "This gnosis dispels all limitations of consciousness, banishes that agnoia which has the twilight of hell as its furthest margin. The perfecting of gnosis is the contemplation of the divine light of the Holy Trinity, that full consciousness which is the parousia, the judgment, and the entering into eternal life." The capability of the soul to receive and experience grace, however, would be vain if God's very mode of being didn't allow for it in the first place. Without a God simultaneously transcendent and immanent, spiritual consciousness would have to consist either in imagining the divine with no experience of it, or in becoming one with some not personal pantheistic reality, both of which have nothing in common with the orthodox understanding of Gnosis and Theosis. Thus, a proper concept of man's spiritual life requires, first of all, a correct image of God and His grace, identified by Lossky with the doctrine of St. Gregory Palamas. Without going into much detail, it is enough to say that Lossky accepts crucial elements of theology of Palamas, which distinguishes between the unknowable essence of God and the participable energies of His nature. Among countless and timeless energies of God, there are some which are responsible for the work of deification, creating participants of God's Trinitarian life. Entering into a synergeia with the human spirit, these divine operations become visible as a true experience of the supernatural realities, the gnosis. Thus, the true Christian knowledge in Lossky turns out to be eventually nothing but the living experience of the self-revealing God, resulting in thousands of everyone who proves worthy of such an encounter. Now, let's quickly move to the conception of Gregory Palamas, who also makes many references to the term of gnosis. Maybe it is already good to notice that Palamas seems to possess at least three different ways of understanding gnosis. First of all, Gregory Palamas was a very strong defender of the hesychastic tradition, and thus opposes the usage of secular wisdom among the monks. Okay, so what I mean by this is that many of Palamas's adversaries, like Barlaam, claimed that the monks should have a secular education because it is a necessary means to know God. And on defending the simplicity of monastic life, Palamas obviously doesn't hesitate to fundamentally oppose this sort of thinking. As he writes, by examining the nature of sensible things, these people have arrived at a certain concept of God, but not at a conception truly worthy of him and appropriate to his blessed nature. For their hearts, darkened by the machinations of the wicked demons, showed this false knowledge. For example, Palamas points out that it were the Greeks who claimed that there are many gods, that there is a world which is ever existing, or that there is a matter which is as eternal as God himself. So all these false concepts of the Greeks should be abandoned together with its source, as a good tree does not produce bad fruit. The Hellenic knowledge, Gnosis, unworthy of this name, is thus nothing but the wisdom of this age, a false teaching belonging to the demons. Yes, so this is the first meaning of Gnosis in Palamas. So a Gnosis as a profane, harmful knowledge, which has nothing in common with the life of Christians, but is a fruit of Greek philosophy. However, by opposing the secular knowledge of Greeks, Palamas doesn't oppose the natural knowledge as such. Palamas opposes the knowledge of Greeks, the secular knowledge of Greeks.
He
opposes it, but he doesn't oppose knowledge of nature as such. Mm-hmm. So, on the contrary, Palamas recognizes a true knowledge of God obtained through the mediation of the creatures. As he writes, the misuse of the knowledge of created things creates the wisdom which is madness. But if one uses these things properly, then through the knowledge of created things, spiritually understood, one will arrive at the knowledge of God. Mm-hmm. And this is the second meaning of Gnosis in Palamas.
Это второе определение гнозиса.
So, a good knowledge of God taken from his creatures. Still belonging to the realm of the creation, there is also a third type of gnosis, which is a supernatural knowledge beyond the created. Okay, so I'm very sorry it takes so long, but I will try to summarize my ideas. So I have already presented two ideas of knowledge, gnosis in Palamas. First of all, when Palamas says about gnosis, he thinks about the bad knowledge of Greeks, the false knowledge that the Greek philosophers by which the philosophers tried to know God, but obviously they were mistaken. Second of all, when he says about gnosis, he thinks about this good knowledge which can be obtained through creatures. He doesn't really say specifically what it is, but it is important that he sees a possibility of a true knowledge of God through the creatures. Now, thirdly, there is a third meaning of gnosis, which is the spiritual knowledge obtained by grace. And this is a knowledge which is an effect of the purification of human nature. Because as Palamas says, how can a person be totally healthy if his cognition, intellect, is still sick? Thus suggesting that whenever saints obtain a special relation with God, purifying their natures, they also have to possess a specific spiritual knowledge. This is the knowledge visible in many saints also in our times who, by the grace of God, see the truth of the past, the present, the future, and the eternal. And speaking about all these different types of gnosis, at every single time Palamas underlines that all of them differ from the end of human life. This is the union with God. As he says, this union is an ignorance over the knowledge, because in this union all mental activities must stop. Thus, whenever we speak about knowledge in the context of Palamas, it seems that we must think about some sort of intellection, either mistaken because of one's pride and sin, as was the case of the Greeks, or correct when we use our knowledge in a good way, or even as something purified by grace. But still, it is an activity of the mind. When the human person reaches the union with God, then all mental activity, all knowledge must cease. However, it must be noted that Palamas does refer to this biblical idea of knowing God, not as something intellectual, but something supra-intellectual, the knowledge beyond any other knowledge, which is identical with being with God, knowing Him as another person in the union. And now simply to compare the ideas of these both authors. So first of all, we can see that both Lossky and Palamas perceive the spiritual purification as something deeply dependent on the grace of God and something which reaches its climax in the vision of the holy light of Tabor, the union with God. However, they seem to differ in understanding the relation between knowledge as such and the spiritual experience. For Lossky, the Gnosis, the personal spiritual knowledge, is the same thing that the experience of God. So experience and knowledge are mutually, I would say, synonymous in Lossky. On the other hand, Palamas seems to clearly distinguish that the knowledge is also something coexisting with the experience of the divine, but it is somehow secondary, because the grace, first of all, it touches our spirit, and then it creates knowledge in our minds. However, we may see that possibly these differences arise from different traditions from which both authors try to draw on. So from the one point of view, Palamas, being a scholar, being educated in Aristotelic philosophy, seems to accept this intellectual definition of knowledge first. And also triads, being a response to Barlaam and other people who attacked the Hesychasts, he tries to show them that the being with God has nothing to do with the secular understanding of knowledge. On the other hand, Lossky, who is a representative of the apophatic understanding of the theology, understands the knowledge of God in this very apophatic sense, as a knowledge of union, as a knowledge which transcends the mind itself. As the very last words, I would like to say that even although these two authors seem to differ in the way they use the term gnosis, they seem to have the very same understanding of the spiritual life. Also, Lossky seems to be a very interesting author, because in his modern usage of words, he doesn't translate gnosis as knowledge, as it usually is done, but he uses another weird term of consciousness, a term usually connected with modern psychology, but not really present in the theological discourse. Thus, it may seem that Lossky tries to introduce a new notion of consciousness, which includes both the perception of the divine reality and the profound truth of personal relation between God and man. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Вопросы какие-то будут?
The question: if you gain the knowledge,
Yes.
doesn't it deny the faith?
No, because as I mentioned, for Palamas, a human is a whole integral being, which consists of both the body, the soul, and the spirit. Thus, whenever a man approaches God and divine grace fills the man, every single faculty of man must be also working and purified. Thus, the idea of theosis in Lossky has nothing to do with Gnostic differences between, for example, the spiritual and the bodily, or the faith or the knowledge. But for Palamas, whenever God works in a man, then every single faculty of man, his senses, his intellect, must also be directed towards God and are good. Thus, Palamas would say that no, the faith does not contradict knowledge, but on the other hand, the faith is productive of knowledge, but the true knowledge of God and His mysteries. Okay. Спасибо.
Well, thank you. And I thank you for your very difficult, almost impossible to accompany such a rich presentation and complex presentation. But I would ask you, though, about Lossky and the world. I mean, it's as one becomes a person in the process of personalization, isn't it also true that creation is also transformed through Lossky? So
yes.
when you focus on the Gnos and also the Theosis,
yes,
something is happening in the world as well.
Yes. So, thank you for your question. So, certainly, Lossky perceives the purification, the personalization, as the process of becoming spiritual in whole. So thus, first of all, what happens in man is that all his created faculties, his body, becomes spiritual, becomes conscious in this very sense of Lossky. Thus, through this understanding, one may say that also whole activity of man, obviously also directed towards the created world, is the activity of spiritualization in this good sense of making all the created world spiritual.
The new creation.
Sorry?
A new creation.
Yes, a new creation, because obviously Lossky bases his idea of both human and the world on the assumption that this world is somehow fallen, is somehow corrupted by the sin. So any return towards the original harmony between the spirit and the matter, the body, is simultaneously both a new creation and a return to the primordial creation of God. Yes, if I may, yes.
Yes, in your conclusion, you seem to oppose the way Lossky approaches the vision of God by apophatic methodology. Yes, and you said that in contrast, Palamas was more Aristotelian. My question is, in fact, I have the impression that Palamas was also using apophatic arguments towards the vision of God. So the contrast seemed to me too much.
Yes, so thank you for the question. So what I meant by this contrast is not that these two authors perceive the reality of union as something different, but that the notion of knowledge is simply rooted in different traditions. Because Palamas, when he thinks about knowledge, Gnosis, then he thinks about something intellectual. And this is simply coherent with the cultural meaning of knowledge in the Hellenic Empire. On the other hand, when Lossky thinks about knowledge, he rather seems to draw on the tradition of Clement of Alexandria, for whom Gnosis has this very particular spiritual understanding. So obviously, they both perceive the reality of union as something, as the same reality. But for Palamas, it is a reality which cannot be called knowledge, because knowledge is something mainly intellectual. Well, for Lossky, it is exactly the climax of knowledge, because knowledge is the experience of the living God. Have I anyhow answered your question?
Not totally, because I think that in fact the influence of Denis is very strong on both authors.
Yes, certainly, but still we see this very, at first, striking difference between the way they use knowledge and the connotations of this knowledge. So obviously they both have a lot of common roots, and Lossky bases his ideas in a very huge, to a very huge extent on Palamas. But it seems to me very obvious that, at least superficially, they must have had different roots of first meaning of knowledge. Because for Palamas, this meaning is first of all intellectual, for Lossky it's first of all spiritual. So what I mean is a difference of terms rather than a difference of understanding of the dynamics of being.
Спасибо.
Спасибо.